Now, without further ado, let's start with the first session, titled 2 Years in, Indo-Pacific Strategy and Canada's Trade Engagements in the Region. This session will be moderated by Jeff Mahone, Director of International Business and Geopolitical Advisory at Strategy Corp, who previously served as Deputy Director of the China Division at Global Affairs Canada. Thanks a lot, and Jeff will introduce the other panelists. This session started a little bit later. We started the conference a little bit later, so still we'll have an hour and 15 minutes for this session, and then we immediately after will proceed to the second panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Bijan, and thanks to everybody for showing up today for this important event. I came here last year and I found it to be a very productive use of time. So the Indo-Pacific Strategy just marked its second birthday last month, and it's pretty important because it is this government's flagship foreign policy program, and it's put in place a framework to help manage relations and deepen connections with this critical region at a time of geopolitical flux. And particularly, as some of them are as Bijan and others have noted, with the challenge we're facing, not just in Asia, but also closer home to Canada here, it's critical that we have new markets to diversify to. I shouldn't say new markets because they've obviously been around for a very long time. And Canada, I think, is probably in its 151st iteration of trying to diversify its economy. It's quite a difficult thing to achieve. So it's really important to have these strategies, but it's even more important that we get the people on the ground, the businesses, not just the policymakers, to be driving action. So it's really good to see LNG Canada to take here as a lead sponsor. So IPD has put together a really good panel today to discuss this topic, and it consists of former policymakers, business practitioners, and scholars as well. And they're going to help us put the Indo-Pacific into context and understand where things are today and where they might be able to go in the future. Next to me is Julie Nguyen, who's chair of the Canada-ASEAN initiatives at the York Centre for Asian Research at York University, and she's also the director of the Canada-Vietnam Trade Council. Then we've got Sonny, who is president and CEO of the Canada-Korea Business Council and is an advisor here at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. And then we've got Roberto Bagnato, who's marketing business partner for the Indo-Pacific Strategy at Export Development Canada, and then we've got Shantz, president of the Canada-China Business Council, who's also a former Director General at Global Affairs Canada's North Pacific. The names have changed a bit since then, but he played a pretty important role there as well. And then my good friend Carlo Dade, who's Director of the Trade and Trade Infrastructure Center at the Canada West Foundation. So I'll just go over a couple quick housekeeping items, which was we're going to do a few rounds of moderated questions here with our panelists, and then we have 15 minutes at the end that we'll turn to Q&A. And there's microphones here and here that you'll be able to line up at the appropriate time. So we'll kick things off with Julie. And while this panel's title, includes the trade engagement aspects, and indeed, it's the commercial relations really are where the rubber meets the road for most everyday Canadians. However, the IPS is also much more than trade. It has two other pillars, diplomacy and security. Now, all three pillars have sprung activities and initiatives since the IPS was launched a couple of years ago. So I'd like to hear from you, Julie. Where do things stand today, and what should we look at for measuring success of this initiative?
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Jeff. The Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, to me, is about building stronger and more diverse relationships, especially with the emerging countries. And this is for Canadian interests and also for mutual interests and mutual prosperities. I have been following foreign relations since the TPP in 2011 and also the U.S. Indo-Pacific Framework in 2016, and then ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific in 2019, and especially with Canada's Indo-Pacific Strategy in 2022. And in the past 2 years, there have been positive changes, especially with the Canadian presence in the Indo-Pacific. We have trade missions by Team Canada with Trade Commissioner Service, Global Affairs Canada, to many countries in Asia. We had trade missions to Vietnam, Malaysia in last March, and just now in December to the Philippines and Indonesia. We also have new EDC, Export Development Canada offices in Asia. We have agricultural office in the Philippines. So these are positive developments. I think right now it is an interesting time in history to build relationships with our strategic partners for our prosperity, and also in order to have this trade to achieve prosperity, we need the stability, and therefore security is very important, so that we can have this shared effort with our shared interest to achieve our objectives in the Indo-Pacific strategy.
All right, thanks, Julie. Yeah, that's a good starting point. And if we want to understand the IPS, we really, of course, need to look at what's happened in the past couple of years, and Julie's given us a good overview there. But as we all know, Canada's been engaging with the region long before there was an Indo-Pacific strategy. And we could probably benefit from a bit more of a historical view if we want to better judge the IPS's successes, its failures, and its future. So I'm going to turn to Graham. Now, you joined the Federal Public Service back in 1990 and spent pretty much your whole career either living in Asia or working on Asia issues. And from a vantage point of over 30 years steeped in the Canada-Asia relationship, how do you rate Canada's engagement in the region?
Thanks. Thank you very much, and thanks to IPF for hosting an event for someone who's done a lot of Asia, as you've mentioned, Jeff, over my professional career and also as a student then as well. In fact, in the 1980s, I was just going through my mind, I lived a year in Japan, 2 years in China, but probably the greatest influence was 3.5 years in the United States of America studying economics, which has forever scarred me with a strong American bias on economics in the cornfields of Indiana. So for any economist, it's in the shadow of the Chicago School, I suspect, of economics. But when I joined the Federal Public Service in 1990, 1991, I was just thinking that was the 34th Parliament of Canada. So yeah, I do want to take a prosperity perspective on my comments, and rather than focusing on just the last 2 years, I'd like to focus on what's happened from a Canadian interest perspective with a prosperity lens since about that time to about now, which is the 44th Parliament of Canada. And there were 5 prime ministers in that time. Episodically, I would say, interested in Asia, almost entirely from a prosperity perspective. So I think setting that context, when I joined in the early 90s, we were going into a pretty steep recession. There were some national unity issues at home as well at that time. And Asia, China initially, but the rest of Asia subsequently, was a solution to job creation in Canada. So it really was a prosperity perspective. But when I look at our trade account, the trade and goods account from 1990 till now, at that time, 75% of our exports went to the single market of the United States of America. Today, 75% of our exports go to the United States of America. Our largest export item, I don't have to tell LNG Canada or Carlo, is energy, globally. And of course, 99% of that goes to one market. It was, Paul, your comment about the largest private sector investment that Canada's ever seen is instructive. We have been exporting energy products to Asia over the last few years. We don't count it as such. It counts as our exports to the United States of America. So there's some Canadian companies that have signed gas supply agreements, some of which is already being delivered to LNG facilities in Texas and Louisiana. And that's accounted for as an export to the US. On the import side in Asia, that's accounted for as an import from Asia. So in my time in government, when I would meet with Asian diplomats, many of them would say, we like your values, but we'd really like your hydrocarbons. Those are like-minded, what we would describe politically as like-minded countries who are telling us that. It's a supply chain, as Paul just mentioned, that comes from a different angle. It doesn't go through the Malacca Straits. It doesn't go through the Taiwan Straits. It comes from on a shorter route from northern part of North America. So that's important for us from a diversity perspective. But when I look at how would I grade from a prosperity perspective how we're doing, I guess I would say every government I served when I was in the public service would grade themselves A or A+. But I think if we compare ourselves to anyone, I think it needs to be Australia. And if I look at how we stack up to Australia over that same time frame, from 1990 till today, and I use as crude as it is, GDP per capita lens, you can map for anyone who has spare time. You can go to the World Bank. There's a lovely website, and you can look at GDP per capita over time for any country that's party to the World Bank. So if you do that, you'll see this chart. Now it's expressed in US dollars per capita, so it is the strength of the US reserve currency, or the global reserve currency in effect, notwithstanding efforts to wish it to be otherwise. The US is just incredible in its upward slope. It doesn't matter whether it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration over that time. All of the ink that's spilled over various issues politically in the US, if you look at that chart, they have the benefit, it's their yardstick, it's their currency, so there's a benefit in that. But it is upward sloping. Even when that great innovative economy to our south develops new instruments like collateralized debt obligations and causes a global financial crisis, there's a little dip down, but it carries on. And under the current US administration, it actually slopes even higher upwards, which may be its deficit, I don't know. So let's not compare ourselves to them. Let's compare ourselves to Australia, which in 1990 was about 20% lower on GDP per capita than Canada, and today is about 25% higher than Canada. There are a lot of things that make the comparison worthwhile. One is they're dependent on commodity exports, as is Canada. Two is they have a strong immigration tradition and continues to this day. Three is it's the same political system, decentralized federation. And they were next to the growing Asian economy, largely China, not exclusively, over that time period. But we're next to what most people in the world are looking for, most countries in the world are looking for, the greatest resource on earth, which is the US consumer. So we have that advantage. And in that time, Australia passed us. It was coming up to us and the Asian financial crisis hit. It went back down a bit, and then it passed us in 2009, and it's separated from us since then. So I guess, Jeff, I would say from a prosperity lens over, I guess I would, having a bit of an Asian perspective, still call that a relatively short period of time. It's not the 2-year Indo-Pacific strategy of this government, but it is 30 years, and it's a pretty short period of time. And I'd say while we've underperformed, there are, from this perspective, there are some positive things happening. And energy direct exports through TMX on oil, and LNG Canada and other LNG products in the projects in the West Coast mean that there's the hope to perform better as it relates to diversifying our trade. Thanks.
Thanks, Graham. That's really, really helpful. And this notion of underperformance means that there's an ideal performance we'd like to reach, a strategy, a goal we'd like to achieve. And if we want to realize the success of the IPS that it envisions, we're going to need more than just a government strategy. We're going to need businesses, and particularly SMEs, to get involved in the region to drive exports. And as has been outlined, our trade dependence on the U.S. only highlights how far it is we have to go if we want to be a Pacific power in more than just name only. So I want to turn to Sonny, and like Graham, you've got a deep experience in the region, and in particular when it comes to supporting SMEs. So I'd like to hear from you, how is the IPS viewed from the vantage point of Canadian businesses? What kind of impacts or differences have you observed for SMEs before and after the IPS? And what it really boils down to is, does the IPS bake commercial bread, or is it just another strategy in a world awash with strategies?
Thanks, Jeff, and thank to IPD. Yes, overall for the SMEs, the Indo-Pacific strategy has been fairly positive. As an example, Canada signed the free trade agreement with South Korea about 10 years ago. And until about a few years ago, it's been fairly quiet. There was no government activities. Canadian SMEs are, busy just dealing with the U.S. mostly. We've been talking about trading and diversifying for many, many years, but it really didn't move the needle that much. But in the last few years, certainly the initiatives taken on by the government to take SMEs overseas, especially, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Indonesia. It helps a lot of the SMEs when they do this, because the branding in Asia for Canada is it's nice people, nice country. We send our kids to study over there. It's a safe place. But if you ask them, what does Canada make? No one can tell you what Canada makes. They'll say lobster, nice soybeans maybe, but that's still the image we have in Asia. So we need to deploy a lot more resources. The strategy is good, but it's for business, it's all in the execution. And it's a huge task, because Indo-Pacific is not small; it's huge, and just going back to what Grant was saying about Australia, most Canadian SMEs, when I talk to them, they say, yeah, but Australia is much closer to South Korea. No, it isn't. It takes 9 hours from Vancouver to South Korea. It takes 11 hours from South Korea to Sydney, okay? So it may be that it's a blessing and a curse for having a U.S. as a neighbor, because we rely on the biggest economy, and it's same language, similar culture, time zones easier, but Australia doesn't have that kind of a luxury like with Canada has. So they're much more adventurous and much more aggressive in targeting not only South Korea, but Japan and China and other Asian countries. So they sell 5-6 times more than what Canada sells just to South Korea. So it's important that we change the attitude and culture of the Canadian SMEs. Sometimes we pat ourselves on the back saying, Canadians are innovative and all that, but if you look at the facts, the Canadian SMEs are not adventurous, especially to the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific. So this is something that government can play a very important role in educating and trying to. It's tough to change a culture overnight, but we have all the advantages here. We've got people from all over the world that we can take advantage of in dealing with different countries on whether it's export and trade. But it's in the last few years it's been good. Canada and South Korea has been very active. 2-on-2 meetings between the defense and foreign affairs ministers. Korea wasn't paying that much attention to Canada either before. Korea was just as guilty. They were always looking at U.S. or China, but because of the conflicts and tensions with China and Russia, they started paying a lot of attention to Canada too. They're already working very actively trying to sell submarines to Canada. We'll talk further a little bit later about what's happening in South Korea. What kind of impact that'll have on the relationship we've been building in the last few years. It's been very good, but it might be a little bit different. But as I mentioned, there's a lot more work to be done in building relationships with the countries in the Indo-Pacific.
Thanks, Sonny. So we just heard a bit about how the IPS could be viewed by businesses, what's the effects it's having for business, and but at the end of the day, the IPS is a government strategy, and it's a whole of government approach to dealing with the region, and that also includes crown corporations. So we've got Roberto, who's with Export Development Canada, and I'd like to hear a bit more about from the other side of the equation. So how does one of Canada's most important crown corporations see the Indo-Pacific? How has the Indo-Pacific impacted EDC's operations? And would it be fair to say that businesses could think of EDC a bit as an instrument for the IPS?
Thanks so much for that too, and I want to start by thanking the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy in Bijan as well for the invite as well. It's a great question, Jeff. On our side of the strategy from Export Development Canada's perspective, and maybe a quick way of intro, we're a Crown Corporation, we're Canada's export credit agency, and we support Canadian businesses in three very distinct ways. The first is on a financing perspective, so we can sit with a financial institution to directly support Canadian growth into international markets or export. We can support from an insurance standpoint as well, ensuring export credit sales globally. And on the third side, on the advisory and connection side of our business too, and that's the piece that we're excited to chat about today. So from the Indo-Pacific strategy perspective, EDC was preparing for Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy a few years ago, but we've long been in the region as well. Our representation in India celebrated 10 years a few months ago. Our standalone branch in Singapore, which can underwrite support businesses in the the same time zone, that they're dealing with, has celebrated its 8th year as well. And so, from our standpoint, we'd like to get closer to trade and to business as well. And so, to date, we've got 14 representations in the Indo-Pacific region, and for us, it represents two pieces: one, an opportunity for Canadian businesses, but two, an opportunity for the government of Canada to get much closer to Canadian businesses who have been forging in the Indo-Pacific region long before we have from a government of Canada perspective. And so if we look at the last 2 years of progress, I think it's a bit naive to view the strategy as a success or a lacking of a success in a very short period of time. For us, messaging to Canadian customers, we typically always revert back to 3 Ps: patience, persistence, and price in the region. And so I think the most important one there is patience. From our standpoint, we've been critical of ourselves as well from Export Development Canada, previously opening representations in the region and moving away to focus on other places, but realizing that the number one thing Canadian businesses need is long-term support from the government that is joint across all partners too. And so often we hear from businesses in the region, we have Canadian partners here. When we talk to international partners, they say, we've talked to somebody from Canada here, but you're all here saying different things at different times. And so if we look at the last 2 years of the strategy, I think one of the biggest learnings are coming in unison to the region. And we've seen that now with the Team Canada trade missions as well. Over the last year, upwards of 700 different contact Canadian business leaders going into the region with all of our Government of Canada partners, Canada West Foundation, Export Development Canada, TCS, GAC, and many others as well, FCC, who I saw earlier in the room too. And so that unified approach, I think, is ultimately how we're going to get to closing that trade gap that we see as well. I know you mentioned, and we previously chatted about as well, our reliance on the U.S. and what that means for the IPS and the Indo-Pacific strategy. And candidly, a lot of the conversations we had over the last couple of years with Canadian businesses are, I've got guaranteed contracts in the U.S. or Latin America. Why should I look at the Indo-Pacific? It's farther away. They speak a different language. It's harder to get to. Why does that make sense? And in the last few months, we've seen a lot of Canadian companies come back to us saying, you know that country in the Indo-Pacific that you mentioned, Indonesia or Korea or China? How do I get there now? Because now that there's not as a guaranteed or a sure thing in with our partners south of the border and potentially rough waters ahead, a lot of Canadian companies are now starting to look at that medium and long-term approach and the huge opportunities that that make sense and are currently available in the Indo-Pacific. And so from EDC's perspective, we've invested in the region. We're continuing to invest in the region. So we just opened 3 new representations this past year, actually 2 in the last 2 weeks in Ho Chi Minh City and Manila as well. Next year, we're doubling down on that as well, opening a representation in Thailand and furthering our approach and our presence in China as well. So all these things on our side say progress has been made, but still a lot more to do, Jeff.
Yeah, that's a great operational update from where things are from the vantage point of EDC. So in this first round of questions, we've looked at where do things stand right now in terms of the strategy turning 2 years, some historical context, the business view, and a government view, but it's still incomplete because we've only looked at things internally from the perspective inside in Canada. But if we really want to understand the IPS, we also got to look at it more relationally. Now, Carlo, you just came back from China. Literally, he flew in this morning. I think he landed at 5 a.m. here. Your microphone's on. You don't need to. You're good. And so you've got some fresh insights there. The IPS, as we know, is in a lot of ways is a product of the rise of China, and it reflects Canada's view of the region, and particularly with that notion of the diplomatic, the security, and the commercial all being in flux. So I'd like to know, from that recent trip you've had, or more generally, did you gather any insights into how Canada and the IPS is currently being viewed in that country?
It's not. Next question. No, in all seriousness, I'll take a deeper stab at that. But I want to take a second to acknowledge not just the Institute, but Bijan for keeping this conference going for 4 years. This is the only event we have in Canada that's focused on our second most important relationship after the U.S., some would argue in the longer term, perhaps eventually one day equal to the U.S. It's been a one-man crusade, and he really deserves credit and acknowledgement. Putting on a conference like this is difficult. Ottawa can make things easier or can make them more difficult, and he's managed to persevere. So he really deserves, I think, a hand. Asia-Pacific Foundation and Canada West were partners last year. We weren't able to do that this year, but I do hope that Calgary returns next year, and I look forward to having Calgary back as a partner in the conference. So, I also need to thank, I don't know if anyone from the government of China or the embassies here, but I do need to thank them for sponsoring my trip, having me over and hosting me for over a week in China, taking me around, meetings with ministers, et cetera. So, yeah, Jeff, in all the conversations I had with MOFCOM, MOFA, other government departments, free trade zones, Chinese think tanks, universities, the IPS never came up. No one asked questions about it. The U.S. did suck some of the oxygen out of the room in the conversations, but there certainly was enough oxygen left to discuss Canadian engagement in the region. I didn't bring it up, and I was there for 9 days, and no one else brought it up in any of the conversations. What did get mentioned were the concrete points of engagement. LNG, that did come up. The facility at Rupert that we've just completed, that's prepared to send more LNG to Asia, was mentioned. There's an appetite for our energy. And on agriculture, there was also talk about increasing trade. Let me get the words correct. Cooperation, increased cooperation on agriculture is something that's also on the table. But it's the concrete things that are there. It's LNG, not just in selling LNG to China, but in Chinese participation in building the facility in Rupert. The Dragon Queen was the ship that was driving the pilings into the ground outside of Rupert. It was Chinese assets participating in building infrastructure in Canada. So there is still cooperation, and that's what's more important than the strategy itself. But look, as we've said, and as Roberto acknowledged, this is a long-term game. We're finally thinking beyond next quarter or Canada's typical 3-year project funding cycle. I mean, we did 5 years with the Indo-Pacific. That's it. It's a start. It's not 3 years. But if we can keep that up, then we will have the investment that produces the capital, which we can draw down to further enhance our relationship, to solve future problems. But the strategy itself, the announcement, the talking points you'll get from foreign affairs aren't what's important here. They're important for the government to go to Parliament or to go elsewhere or to go out and give talks. When the government does appear on stage, it would be nice to have them back eventually with us. But it's important, I think, for the very insular world of Ottawa, the talking points. The substance is boots on the ground. It's gas being delivered. It's people that are going over to engage, meet, and talk with other people. The IPS is not a factor yet. But, to Roberto's point, if we wait maybe 10 years, it will be. But we're never going to get to that 10-year point if we don't stick with it now, despite the weak returns early on. Sorry, the weak returns on optics early on.
Thanks, Carlo. So that helped set us down the path of tapping into our panelists' regional expertise. So I think, it'd be probably helpful to continue down this road because we've got a diversity of perspectives there. But we do also have another China expert up on stage, and that's Graham. He's worked on Chinese commercial issues at both as a government official and as an advocate for industry. And Graham, right now there's a lot of conversation that stems from US-China tensions. And sometimes this gets described as deglobalization or fragmentation. We'd like to hear your view on that.
Yeah, it's, I guess a couple thoughts on that. Jeff, I was just reflecting as you were talking about the long run. When I was in Beijing about 3 weeks ago, it was APEC in Peru. And it made me think about, okay, when was the last time Canada hosted APEC? The answer is 1997. How many times has Canada hosted the APEC leaders meeting and all those meetings? The answer is once, 1997, in the last century. Peru had just hosted it for the 3rd time. When I landed in Beijing, there was a gap, an unannounced host for 2026. South Korea will host next year, 2025. And it would appear as though they were just waiting for China to make the announcement at Peru, because then China stepped in to host in 2026. Canada's not hosted in this century. You can't, I'm not going to blame governments. They've decided it's not worth it. So it's difficult to host from a whole bunch of perspectives. There's logistics, there's security, et cetera. But it's also politically difficult because you're inviting leaders from countries that you don't necessarily get along with entirely. So it's not easy. So it's been clearly the decision of multiple governments in the last 30 years, almost 30 years, that it's not worth it from a Canadian interest perspective. I'm not going to fault them. I'm just saying that's a fact. And that gets noticed in the Asia-Pacific. To your question on the Asian opportunity economically, in sort of hard economic terms, China's economy is about $19 trillion. The rest of Asia is about $18 trillion US dollars. So that's the Asian opportunity, and of course broken down into a whole bunch of small and differentiated economies and interests and opportunities from a Canadian commercial perspective. We've talked a lot about goods exports. There's a huge services piece that goes on there, particularly financial services, and particularly if you get into insurance and Canadian insurance interests in Asia. So there's that. There's also the education piece. And also, I would say, however we choose to describe in the Indo-Pacific strategy, the reality is, from a core Canadian interest perspective, it's actually immigration. And there, the Australian comparison is very direct, because our top source countries for immigration for the past decades have been Asia, almost exclusively, but 4 out of the top 5. Same story in Australia. So that's actually our medium to long-term interest. The U.S., I mentioned those gas exports to the U.S. that are getting compressed in Louisiana and Texas and onward shipped to Asian markets. The interesting question is, well, when President-elect President Trump talks of a tariff, is he going to put a 25% tariff on that gas when it crosses over the border through a pipeline en route to Texas? You'd have a hard time thinking that he would, but you've got to. He said he will, so you've got to prepare yourself for that eventuality. It does underscore, to your question, Jeff, about the need for diversification. That is what the TMX expansion provides for Canada. That is what the LNG facilities on the West Coast, none more important from a volume perspective than LNG Canada, provides for Canada. It gives us an opportunity for Canadian business. It gives us some optionality from a Canadian interest perspective. But when President Xi Jinping was in Peru, as you probably noticed, he opened up a new port, joint port, together with Peruvian authorities on the coast of Peru, that can get a lot of Latin American products directly to Asia and China in particular. There was a wonderful chart in the Wall Street Journal that showed those countries as part of APEC. It was an article. The South American, Central American, South American countries' #1 export market 20 years ago, and they did a color-coded map compared to today. And 20 years ago, it was the US. Today, every country in that region, #1 export market was China, except Mexico and Colombia. Those were the only 2 exceptions. So that's the reality if you're in Buenos Aires even. You'll notice there was some change in political language from the candidate to the president by the now president of Argentina over the past 18 months. So there is a gravitational pull that comes with a $19 trillion economy intent on growing larger. Every country's got its own economic challenges, China included, the US, Canada. But that is a trend that has been an intentional act of policy out of China to grow its economy and to need resources from abroad. And then there's a whole bunch of their own strategies. So in a sense, whether or not China has a Latin America strategy, it certainly looks like they've executed one with or without a formal program. So for a Canadian perspective, to have an anchor in the fastest growing economies in the world, Indo-Pacific, is critical for our next years. I do think the immigration piece is worth not forgetting as a core interest. It's been fundamental to one of our greatest exports, education, to our universities and colleges. Notwithstanding current bumps, the fact remains that that's a critical component from a Canadian economic perspective, that students from the Indo-Pacific. And there's a technology flow issue that I won't get into now, but there's an element there which is going to be critical to Canadian prosperity in the long run, Jeff. So a couple of reflections on your question.
Well, that's great. And 2 things immediately jump out to me. And the first is the notion how TMX and LNG Canada are, kind of spearheads for diversifying the economy and engaging with the region with things that they want from Canada. But that wasn't something that was driven by the strategy. That was something that was driven by private sector investment decisions, recognizing demand in the region. So it makes me also just wonder, to what degree could we maybe see a bit of the IPS take more of a push towards supporting those sectors that are, have that high demand? And the other thing that really jumped out to me from your point, and it comes back to that notion of the deglobalization or fragmentation, is at the end of the day, a world trading system is, at least in our historical memory, is anchored by a key market, and for the longest time it's been anchored by the US. Maybe there's a little bit of something to investigate there, given that how many countries now have China as its key market when we're trying to interpret some of the shifts that are going on underway. But we'll leave that for another time, because we want to stick with the country focus. And one shortcoming of this panel, and hey, nobody's perfect, is we don't have an India expert up on stage. But fortunately, we've got EDC, who flagged earlier that they've been in the region for a number of years. So we're going to put it on your shoulders, Roberto, to talk about amidst the political tensions between those two countries, and we won't get into everything about it, but where commercial relations seem not to be affected. So what's EDC's views on trade with India?
It's a real easy one, Jeff. No, but in all seriousness, I know we talked earlier about it. EDC celebrated 10 years in market as well, just a number of months ago. And while things from a geopolitical standpoint between Canada and India are far from perfect, I'm gonna refrain from commenting on things geopolitically. From a business perspective, from what we've been seeing here in Canada and on the ground, things seem to be going, knock on wood at this moment, fairly well considering all that's going on. Last year, EDC supported just under $2.5 billion in trade between Canada and India, supporting just over 400 companies as well. We're tracking to surpass that number this year as well. We've maintained our strong relationships as well in the market too, with Tata Group, ABG, and Mahindra as well. From their perspective, there's still a need for two things. One, financing from a Canadian perspective, but two, Canadian supply and innovation. And so up until this point on this panel, we've talked a lot about energy, we've talked a bit about agri-food, but I think one of Canada's great supplies is our innovation and our technology. And if you look at the Indian market, with a growing middle class, a large percentage of their population under 35, it's going to result in a few things. One is a need for food and food security in the region. And while India is a great producer of agri-food, what they're not is one that's very sustainable. And if you look at the recent trends in Canadian innovation, an opportunity for Canada to influence the market is around sustainable farming and how we can support ensuring food security in not just India, but other countries in the Indo-Pacific region. Another perspective is on advanced manufacturing. And as you have a population that's growing, especially a rapidly growing middle class, the need for more products and services comes through in sodas on the advanced manufacturing side. And so what we've been seeing is trends from an agri-food perspective and an advanced manufacturing perspective as well. But I think first and foremost, what we've been seeing is a huge trend on the infrastructure side. And so as the population grows, there's a need to house this population from an infrastructure perspective. A huge theme that we're seeing, and I think many partners around the table here are seeing too, is a transition for cities in the region to become smart cities, and it represents a huge opportunity from Canada's perspective, not just to support on where we've traditionally supported engineering, project management, construction, but also in helping support that transition as well. So a few key buckets. I think one, Jeff, candidly, we'll see our relationship from a business perspective and a commercial standpoint with India continue to grow. At least that's our optimism from Export Development Canada's perspective. We're continuing to support the region and with a growing presence with our staff in the region as well.
All right, yeah, thanks a lot, Roberto. So when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, it seems that China and India tend to suck up all the oxygen in the room, but there's also a critical growing region, which is the ASEAN economies. And we've got one of Canada's premier ASEAN experts on stage today. So, of course, I'm going to turn to Julie. And, we've got a lot of background, the Indonesian, ASEAN FTAs. There's no shortage of opportunities afoot. So I'd like to hear from you, though. How important is the IPS for Canada's engagement with the ASEAN countries?
Hello. Yes, thank you, Jeff. Last year, Canada-ASEAN trade was about $39 billion. And the Indo-Pacific Strategy has provided the framework. What we need now is strategic implementation to bring that $39 billion to many folds. So in terms of the free trade agreements, with the CPTPP, Canada has access to 4 ASEAN countries. And recently, we have the Canada-Indonesia economic partnership. And soon, when we have the Canada-ASEAN free trade agreement signed, hopefully next year, then I believe that Canada's trade with ASEAN will increase significantly. But still, as Sonny and Roberto as mentioned, that we need to build relationships on the ground. That is very important. So speaking of strategic implementation, I believe that we need to build strategic partnerships in trade. So when we go back to basic definition of strategy, that is what to do and what not to do, so that we can focus our resources to do what we need to do. So for example, Vietnam is the largest trading partner in ASEAN for Canada. Last year, Canada-Vietnam trade was $14 billion. So we might look into the success factor, the factors, how Vietnam was able to increase trade with Canada. And we also look at, for example, Malaysia will be chair of ASEAN next year. So what would be the role of Malaysia in building more relationship, more trade with Canada? And also we need to identify possible instability so that we can have remedies for that. And we, for example, we need to look at the rise of BRICS, now that 4 ASEAN countries have become BRICS partners. So in that sense, I believe that we need to have a big picture as well to ensure the stability through security measures. For instance, we need to make sure that there is no disruption in the South China Sea, so that the trade route can flow freely. And we want to bring that $39 billion trade with ASEAN to the next level, not just incremental increase, but hopefully a breakthrough here. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you hit on the key theme here, that this underperformance and reaching up to getting that, not just an incremental change, but having a big, meaningful change driven by business through business opportunities. So we've also got Sonny on stage and his role with the Korean background. And Korea is an important like-minded partner in the region, one that I think is becoming increasingly more important. So, though maybe the events from last week left many folks holding their breath, but I would presume that Korea has a very special place in the IPS. So I'd like to ask you, Sonny, what does the IPS's implementation look like when it comes to South Korea?
Yeah, I think Canada and South Korea are really good partners. They both need each other as reliable partners. Obviously, Canada's energy, agri-food, critical minerals are very valuable resources for what South Korea needs. And for Canada, it's to have a stronger tie and presence in the Indo-Pacific on the defense and securities. South Korea is a very important critical partner. And in the last few years, it's been very good. I think in Canada, I was in Ottawa about a month ago. There was a Korea-Canada Defense Cooperation Conference. 2-on-2 meetings, the foreign affairs and defense ministers. It's, in the last 2-3 years, there are more federal cabinet ministers that visited South Korea than probably in the last 30 years. Melanie Joly, Champagne, Bill Blair, even Prime Minister. And, as you know, out of sight, out of mind. It's important to have those high-level visits along with the SMEs and other major corporations too. So the Business Council of Canada also signed a partnership agreement with the Federation of Korean Industries. This is where all the top Korean conglomerates belong, and there will be more cooperations going forward, and that'll help a lot of things. And as you know, the South Korea made major investments in Canada. The huge battery plant going on in Ontario. There's one going in Quebec. There are a lot more Korean investments that I think we can attract. So all the provincial economic development ministers also been very active, going back and forth with South Korea. So I think even the provinces are competing with each other. I think especially Quebec has been very aggressive in deploying their special forces in Japan, Singapore, Korea. EDC opened its office last year. I was at a big splash party in Seoul. So I think that's good. As Minister Melanie Joly mentioned, we used to be good friends. Going historically, Canadian missionaries in the 1890s, helping South Koreans with the independence and our soldiers, Canadian soldiers, sacrificed lives during the Korean War to build the Korea's freedom. And has been a very strong partner for many, many years. So the Koreans really appreciate and respect Canada as very reliable friend and a partner. So we need to take advantage of that. I mean, on the people-to-people side, the Korea sent their firefighters to come and help with the wildfires in Quebec. This year the orchestras, the artists have been exhibiting and touring South Korea, and the South Koreans have been doing the same thing, coming to Canada. Our naval fleets, their naval fleets are going back and forth, visiting each other. So it's good, and even if the governments change both in Korea and Canada, we hope that businesses and institutions like the IPD and other institutions should continue to build this strong relationship, because you need that people-to-people, personal chemistry, personal relationships are very important at all levels to promote our prosperity and our security going forward. The world is very volatile, and it's important that we support each other and work together with the good partners.
Thanks a lot, Sonny. Now, I just took a quick look at the time, so we're going to go to Carlo for the next last regional question, but I just wanted to plant the seed in folks' minds that we are going to move to questions from the audience. So again, we've got 2 microphones up at the front, so start thinking through, and once Carlo finishes, we'll open up the floor. But we're not there yet. And we've got one last Pacific region to consider before moving on, and this one really is a doozy. It's proven very challenging for Ottawa. Different political culture, different economic structure, you name it. And of course, I'm talking about Western Canada. So I'd like to hear from Carlo. And jokes aside, Western Canada really does lead our trade and engagement with the region. And it's absolutely critical. So I'd like to hear from you, Carlo. What does the IPS mean for Western Canada?
I thought you were talking about the U.S., not us. So look, for Western Canada, obviously, if there's one place in this country that's concerned about Asia, I think on all levels, human, economic, political, it's certainly the West. We are the gateway to Asia. We trade the most with Asia, and I'll let you pick your metric to define that. But it's a region that it kind of defines us as much as our relation with the U.S. defines us in the West. And we don't think about that. It's not readily apparent. But when you go outside of Calgary or go outside of Regina, people know who's buying the energy. People know who's buying the agricultural products. If you go to southern Alberta, southern BC, people know where the coal's going, and it's Asia. So for us, the Indo-Pacific strategy was a good signal that Canada was going to devote some long-term resources. It gave cover for the provinces to follow. Several of the provinces have developed Indo-Pacific strategies. Try not to laugh, Jeff. You still have the scars from having gone through this with me. But there is, I think, a signal of seriousness. And again, we're not going to see results except for talking points. But there has been a shift. More offices opening in the region. More visits by premiers, which can be good or bad. But in Asia, it tends to be a lot better than it's been recently in the States. So we have representatives. Saskatchewan has a representative in India that was allowed in while others from Canada were being sent out. So I think the provincial presence is crucial. It's long-term. It's been there for a while. It's not going to waver. I don't think it'll come out. But the point that's critical with all this is the problem is that our attention is still focused on gaining market access at the provincial level, at the federal level. It's not where it needs to be, which is surviving market access. We're in a world where the old institutions are no longer what they were and are not going to be there to protect us and to help us. We need new strategies, new thinking. The Americans invested $28 billion to compensate U.S. farmers for losses from the blowback from the trade war with China. That's more than the GDP of Newfoundland and Labrador and the territories combined. China is building reserves for critical minerals, Everyone else seems to be preparing for a world where the institutions and the rule of law and trade is a second best option. It can't be a first best option. So one thing we're looking for in the West is the Ag Office. Is the Ag Office going to continue to focus on expanding market access, or are we finally going to get serious about defending market access, about taking proactive measures to protect companies that go to Asia, that go into ASEAN, that go into China, that go into India, or that encounter difficulties in these markets? If not, Roberto, we may be inducing companies to just get into trouble as opposed to inducing them to diversify and expand. So that's a critical issue for the strategy in my mind. Have we finally woken up the way the Australians, the Americans, and everyone else has to a new world where institutions are second best to protect us and everyone else is working on developing more proactive trade protection measures?
Thanks a lot, Carlo. All right, I'm looking for people up in the microphones. I don't see them. Hugh, okay, yep, they're right over here, folks, so you can go and line up over there. Go first there.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm Hugh Stevens. I'm a fellow at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada and an advisor to IPD. So to Carlo's point about the West and the Pacific, I live on Vancouver Island, so I can tell you that when I look out my front door, I see the freighters parked in the Gulf Islands waiting to get into the port of Vancouver to be able to ship out coal from Roberts Bank or bring in containers or whatever it is. So it's a very, very real, palpable feeling on the West Coast. A more westerly part than Calgary, but of course the prairies are also extremely important. My question, I guess, is to Carlo initially and also to Graham. So Carlo, you've just come back from China. You didn't talk about the IPS. Did you talk about EV tariffs? Did the Chinese raise this question of Canada's, I guess I could call knee-jerk reaction to impose or to match the tariffs with the US without going through the process as the Europeans did? And on that point, I guess, when you talked about protecting access, I think we all know that the first instinctive reaction was to lash out at something, which I believe was canola. So quite often it seems that Western agricultural interests are made to pay the price for overall industrial policies. That's obviously a national issue that we need to deal with. But the whole question of, and I honestly don't know what the answer is. I don't know that we felt we had a choice, but did that issue come up? And it sort of leads to the broader question as we raise the dikes around Fortress North America, how much policy room do we have left in terms of dealing with China? I know we have a panel this afternoon to also discuss that specifically, but I'd be interested in your thoughts. Thank you.
That would require a few hours to go through. But yes, the issue did come up, not just with the Chinese, but also the Mexicans. I met with the Mexican ambassador, and who was the NAFTA negotiator before moving to Beijing, and the EV tariff issue also came up there. Yeah, you're right. The not even bothering to do a pretense of an investigation was a clear signal, I think, as to the importance of the relationship with the U.S. Though I do have to admit that folks understood the importance of the U.S. relationship, but they were still surprised at just how important it was and how much sway it had over us. You know, they knew we were under the Americans or tied to the Americans. They didn't know that we were America's rhymes with which. And that pretty much was the impression across the board I had from not just the Chinese, but the Mexicans and others that were there too. So I think that's going to have a longer-term impact. We discussed Diefenbaker, and I always brought up the Diefenbaker story about standing up to the Americans when they embargoed grain sales to China during the Great Leap Forward, during the Great Famine, and that was acknowledged. But that and Dr. Bethune, that stuff's in the rearview mirror, and it's getting further and further down the road. And I think the recent events may have just turned the corner on that past history, to take the analogy to its conclusion.
Hugh, I'll just add one thing on that industrial component of Ontario, because I think we used to, at peak, we were around 2 million automobiles a year we produced. So it's Canada's tariff, it's Ontario's largely, not exclusively, Ontario's industry. And I think now this past year we're at, or the next 12 months, it'll be 1.2 or 1.3 million. So it's got challenges even before what's about to hit us hits us.
All right. We'll go to this microphone now.
Thanks. Graham mentioned, you mentioned a technology piece, I think with the Asian-Canada relation. You kind of hinted at that. I just wonder if you might speak to that for a few minutes.
Sure. There's obviously a lot of stuff that gets put into the national security basket now, so I'm not talking about that so much, but let me give you a concrete example. There's a Canadian who'd been born in China who now lives here and was looking for something to invest in and discovered that, well, what about flooring? Now, I think flooring, you know, I know enough national security people that we can probably find a national security risk to flooring for Canadian houses, but I think generally it's pretty safe. So he discovered that the flooring factories in Ontario had technology that was 15 years out of date compared to the flooring factories in China. So he invested in a flooring factory in Ontario to the great benefit of the Canadian economy. So there's technology like that. You can also think robotics. China's got the biggest installed capacity in robotics and manufacturing. We, you know, politically you'll say, you know, good paying middle class jobs in automotive sector, you know, all true, but you're actually, what you need to do if you want to be competitive is robotics, and some of those people that will be on the factory floor are going to be having white lab coats on and high education degrees in software engineering and robotics. It's not the auto factory of 1950 anymore if you want a competitive industry. And I guess my last comment will be on the investment flows, because you need to, I think what we need in Canada is more private sector investment. Paul, I don't know, what was the dollar value that you use for LNG Canada's investment?
40 billion.
So that's 40 billion, biggest private sector investment ever in Canada. And that was over, it took you probably, what is it, 5, 6, 7 years, roughly. So about 5 billion a year. I've got family in Louisiana. Meta, Facebook, just announced a $10 billion plant, cogeneration cycle. I think it's 2,000 megawatts to be built for a data center. That's enough power to power 1 million homes. The Magnificent Seven are investing, big companies in the US are investing $500 billion over the next 12 months in R&D, but also in data centers. And I guess my final comment takes me a bit away from the question, is that energy is going to be hugely important, electricity specifically, if we're going to achieve our own EV ambitions, our own energy ambitions. I don't have to tell you, the BC on any future LNG it has to use renewable energy, and the Site C dams probably already spoken for in terms of its capacity if you go to phase 2 and for everything else that's under demand. But I would just say for Canada, I think a critical element is going to be actually electricity supply. You see some provinces, Ontario, Quebec, BC, to a lesser extent, coming to grips with the fact that we're going to need more electricity. My father was an electrician, so maybe I'm biased. But I do see the need for investment, call it whatever you want, private investment, public investment, renewable energy, clearly. We're going to be stretched, and that large entity to our south is going to start taking our electricity. It will drive our prices up in the same way that when you go to Whistler, you have to pay $180 for a lift ticket. For the Americans, it's only $100. It hasn't increased in 5 years. From the American perspective, from our perspective, it's a lot more. We're going to start to see that in electricity.
Right. Thanks, Graham. Over here.
Thank you. My name is Sean Narayan from St. Thomas University. I was going to ask the question about the EVs and the tariffs, but the sort of segues here. I've been following China's investment in renewable energy. They've driven down the cost of renewables, I think, to where it's less than carbon-based fuels. I think the story is that they built 5 nuclear reactors worth of solar every week. They're 6 years ahead of investment in solar renewables than what they plan to be. This morning I read that by 2040 they might be producing less carbon emissions than the United States. China has a tendency to keep a number of balls going at the same time. So their investment in LNG, for example, is simply one ball. And they have a lot of reasons for wanting to be energy self-sufficient and, frankly, spreading that technology around the world. So is it really a good idea, if we're thinking in the really long term for countries like Canada and Australia, et cetera, I think they hit peak coal this year as well, to be investing in this stuff when one of the major customers seems to be trying to go in a very different direction. So what is the long term that we're thinking about here? Is it 10 years? Is it 20 years? And after 20 years, do our markets disappear? Thank you.
Do you want to take that, Carlo? I think it's part of that question. If you're China and on the coal, so much of what they produced electrically, as you know, was coal, heavily polluting. The natural gas is less polluting, so that's what Paul talked about as a transition fuel. Then the criticism on emissions now is now going to be criticism on, but in effect, you're moving too fast on renewables, which you can't win, right? But I suspect that they will, and I don't think they've moved off of their long-term zero emission target, which I think was 2050 or 2060, I think. But the reality is that they're going to be there much faster. And does that strand assets? I'd let LNG Canada answer that. I think the answer, there's debate between two global institutions over the long run demand for fossil fuels, and we need to find solutions. But there's a debate over that, and that becomes a business decision in effect. So is there a risk? I suspect there is, but I think the transition will take longer than we anticipate. But decarbonization, without question, is the global trend. It is the China trend for sure. Just look at their EV sales. I think it's 10 million a year now, 30 million vehicles, 10 million of which are zero-emission EVs. By far the biggest market, over 50%, and going up.
And very quick, Carlo, because we've got I think we're only going to have time for 2 more questions because we are bumping up against. So if you can give a quick answer, and then we'll get the last 2 of the folks that were in there at once.
The transition, as Graham mentioned, I think it's going to be a bit longer. China's not building assets to strand them. They're still taking LNG. They've cut new coal plants. They stopped building coal plants. The BRI is no longer supposedly financing coal plants. So peak coal maybe, but the transition will be longer. I would note, though, that the renewable energy field, I don't think is set. The Americans, the incoming Trump administration, if you read the analysis of the work done by the America First movement, which we've done at Canada West, it's online, but the Project 2025 calls for a gutting of the renewable sector in the U.S. So the world's largest market, arguably after China, for renewables is set to be upended, kneecapped to some degree. So we're really going to have to go back, especially in Canada. Our calculations on building out renewables based on American demand and American investment is going to need a major rethink and maybe a scrapping and a starting all over again.
Thanks. So I know we started 5 minutes late, so we just got a little over 5 minutes left. We're going to ask both questions at once, and then we're going to use this also as like the final remarks from all of our speakers. So with you first, and then gentleman over there.
Sure. Thank you so much. My name's Erica. I'm a master's student at Carleton. We were talking a lot about the LNG trade between Canada and potentially Taiwan. What I'm curious about is there, do we see a possibility in the future for Canada to be investing in more critical infrastructure to produce LNGs within Taiwan? Because Taiwan itself, it's like 40% reliant on nuclear energy right now, and they're really reliant on imports. But there's a lot of stress in the global supply chain on Taiwan already. They produce most of the world's microchips, for example. So yeah, for sustainable LNG usage, do we see investments into infrastructure in Taiwan? Thank you.
You'd have to have LNG infrastructure receiving terminals. I don't know what it is. I think they have it in Taiwan. LNG, once it hits the water, is if it can, I mean, you've got long-term purchase agreements, but then there's also a tradable component of it. If I'm not mistaken, Paul, I think you can have a shipment go, on the mid-ocean, it can go to another place. So but you do need the receiving infrastructure. But I do think Taiwan has significant LNG receiving infrastructure. But then you'd have to mend that into their policy on zero emission, on decarbonization, and how does that fit?
Receiving infrastructure, but like manufacturing infrastructure.
So the infrastructure money we have to go abroad, there is some in the Indo-Pacific Strategy. Potentially that could be used. There's EDC money that could also be used with the Canadian firms. But I don't know, Paul, that we've got the resources to go outside of Canada. We've got enough work in Canada. The Americans are set to ramp up LNG production massively. And if that's the case, they're going to suck up a lot of resources. I don't know that it's going to be us. It may be Petronas or someone else. But yeah, I don't think that we've got those sort of resources.
I think we need to start focusing on actually delivering these cargoes down the Douglas Channel to the Asian markets. I think it might be a fascinating question for our joint venture participants once we start producing.
Great. And I don't know if anyone saw, but I got an important public service announcement, which we've got a few more minutes allotted to this discussion this morning. So I know that there was at least one person that sat down after having a question, so we will get to go a little bit longer here. So over to you, sir.
So I'm Sarwar Kashmiri, the host of PolarisLive.com series of China and US dialogues. At a private dinner not long ago, I was left with a distinct impression that the US, Canada, Mexico trade pact is not probably going to survive. So I'd just like to ask all of you, what might be the impact, if that happens, on Canada, and of course the US and perhaps Mexico? Just a few lines. Thank you.
I'll start on our side from Export Development Canada's perspective. I think two things. We're cautiously optimistic. I think of moving forward in upcoming President Trump's new administration as well, and that trade between Canada and Mexico and the U.S. will continue. I think a couple of things to note. One of the comments that we've heard very early on after the news post-U.S. election was that this might be an opportunity for Canadian companies to transition their exports from Canada or from the U.S. to other countries. And I think the reality of it is that most Canadian companies, especially those in the SME space, have built the foundation of their businesses on trade to the U.S. And so if you take a piece of the foundation away from their business, you can't just then take that block and put it on top of the roof and expect the structure to still be as strong. And so from our perspective, we're cautiously looking at relationships. We're clearly there continually to support Canadian businesses as waters might be a bit more rough than they have in the past as well. But I think it might be what we needed, as we talked about before, from an Indo-Pacific strategy perspective, that awakening for a lot of Canadian companies to look at what other markets can I look at other than the U.S. Now that becomes more advantageous for Latin America, it becomes more advantageous for Europe, and also becomes advantageous to countries in the Indo-Pacific as well.
If the CUSMA agreement, TMEC, USMCA ends, and we revert back to WTO tariffs, so the two scenarios, there's the 25%, there's also the global baseline tariff that American Compass came up with, Lighthizer, which appears to be off the table but could come back. And then there's the standard CUSMA, the WTO. Canada could survive that. It would be a 0.49% hit to GDP, a similar economic welfare loss to what we've already suffered in the move from NAFTA to CUSMA. So we've already suffered an analogous loss. We've done a line item by line item analysis across Western Canada at the Canada West Foundation. And on average, 40% of tariffs remain at zero for the top 25 goods at the HS4 level. Of course, anyone who knows trade knows HS4 is not where you count tariffs, so we had to do some work to get from HS4 to 12. But the point is 40% remain at zero. For the top four items exported by the Western provinces, in BC, none of the top four take tariff gains in the move. In Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, only 3 of the top 4 see tariffs. Those tariff increases average about 2%. For oil from Alberta, under WTO, we get I think it's 5 cents a barrel hit on our number 1 grade of oil. Number 2 is 10. A 5% hit at $67.50 a barrel is a tariff of 0.007%. So all the calculations we've done show that this is eminently survivable. Our dependence on the U.S. is less economic than it is psychological.
Good point, Carlo.
Thank you. My name is David McKinnon. I'm now former Foreign Service officer, a bit like Graham. Spent most of my career, in fact, all my career overseas in Indo-Pacific, and much of my time at headquarters that way too. And the and Graham mentioning the Australia comparison, I think, is an important one, because we do, as Canadians, naturally spend a lot of time looking south, but actually are, the US is an outlier on so many things, and that our comparisons naturally might be with more comparable countries. And having watched firsthand in my long career the way that there's been that shift in wealth between Canada and Australia. When I first went there in the early 90s, it was a demonstrably less well-off country than Canada is now. You go to a city like Melbourne, and it puts cities like Toronto and Vancouver to shame in terms of the prosperity that's there. And I think with the Australians, and again, having watched this working there and working with Australians abroad, being married to one for a long time, is that the Australians have done a very good job of talking about their prosperity and their security domestically, that they have engaged with Australians about the importance of Asia. They did this Australia in the Asian Century white paper about a dozen years ago under Julia Gillard that involved a huge amount of expertise, but also engagement with Australians, and not just the usual suspects, not just the special interests. It was going out and talking to people, communicating. And what that allowed was for ideas to come out that could survive one government to another. And so my question here is about how do we link what's Canada's interest in the Indo-Pacific with our domestic interests? How do we have that conversation? How do we reach out? And I think there was a huge missed opportunity with the Indo-Pacific strategy that we didn't go out and talk to Canadians. And I think that the other strength that the Australians have had is connecting the security and prosperity elements, that those are seen. And I watched this in India, that when they decided 20 years ago that India was important, it was not only economically, but it was also on the strategic side of things, and they put investments into that. So I'm interested, this has been a very, and I'm an old trade guy, this has been a very trade-focused, it's been the carpetbagger side of things, we have a missionary side of things with us too, but actually how do we broaden that? Because actually our success on trade in places like India, I can say firsthand, is about understanding the broader context. It's not just about doing the sales. So I'm interested in some perspectives.
Hi, David. I'm going to jump in on just very quickly. I think, how do you just word it positively? I'd say catch the kangaroo maybe is one way to try to figure out how to inspire something that gets GDP per capita growth, which leads to bigger options for the national security side, by definition. I guess the negative way to say it is look out below, the Kiwis are coming. So don't get passed by the Kiwis. It becomes a subject for political level, provincially and federally, and in Canada you need to have both. You were talking about the NAFTA, and I remember because I was in Spain as our ambassador, and I was being explained that the regional group of North America, which I assumed include Mexico in the Spanish worldview, does not, of course. North America is the U.S. and Canada. So if we lose, to the question about if we lose Mexico, and there seemed to be a willingness subnationally in Canada and federally to abandon them pretty quickly here. That's not Western Canada, back to Jeff's point. Anyhow, all that to say, it would be, to have that bipartisan agreement on Indo-Pacific would be quite important. I think it's going to be quite difficult.
Are you wanting to jump in, Carlo?
Yeah, unless someone else.
Oh, well, we've got one more question there, and then maybe what did you want to?
Yeah. So very quickly, I don't know that we can. I don't know. I can't. We've been at this for years, trying to come up with a way to make the strategy relevant at the local level. So I go down to Lethbridge. I go to smaller towns and cities across the West where people are exporting to these regions, where they know where the crops are going, and we just haven't been able to make it important. There's just not bandwidth in people's minds. People have busy lives. They're trying to keep their businesses afloat. They've got problems in their communities, and you're trying to get in on a top 10 list that's already overflowing. I don't know how we do this. Public diplomacy is one element, and we've just started that. So hats off to Foreign Affairs for finally starting to fund public diplomacy again, but the way they're doing it actually may do more damage than good. But at least we're trying to address it. But I don't know that we can do this, and I'm going to be sort of contrarian and say, I don't think I'll lay down the challenge. I don't think we can do it.
On that exciting, happy note, we'll turn to our friend from the Vietnamese embassy.
Yes, I'm Nguyen, Chief Trade Representative of Vietnam to Canada. So my question is to all panelists. Since economic security means different things to different countries and different stakeholders, so how do you suggest business community to better navigate the dilemma between security concerns and profitability and efficiencies? Thank you.
And that's a great question on that, finding that right balance on economic security. But I also will add, because that question was presented to all panelists, we'll also use this final 10 minutes to make any final remarks you wanted to in addition to answering that question. So Julie, would you like to lead us off?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think that prosperity is the outcome of relationship, trade, and security, in that order. And the Canada's Indo-Pacific Strategy, the content is precisely that to build relationship, to increase trade, and resilience, supply chain resilience, and also to ensure security. So the past 2 years, as I have seen, is the most exciting time for Canada-ASEAN relations. And that's why I think that we are on the right track for the strategy. When we look at the fact that Prime Minister Trudeau attended the ASEAN summit for the past 3 years, and definitely that would help with building relationships. And we hope that Canadian Prime Minister would continue to attend the summit. But just in case that the Prime Minister would not attend for the next 2-3 years, and we have to plan for that, then there should be initiatives to keep the momentum going. And therefore, I think that we need to well, of course, Canada is already building relationship with each ASEAN country, members, and also as a bloc, we need to continue to build that relationship because each ASEAN country is different. So we need to have a different approach to building relationship on the bilateral and also multilateral approach. So I think that the resources for the Canada Indo-Pacific Strategy for ASEAN can be used strategically to keep this momentum going.
Great, thanks. Sonny?
Yes, you know, as Carlo mentioned earlier, you know, the IPD is probably the only one that's discussing the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. And I've talked to Korean embassy and consul general's office. They say, you know, we get no attention whatsoever with the Canadian media. Canadian media doesn't cover anything about South Korea. So we need more conversations in Canada and pay more attention to what's happening in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific. Otherwise, we can't make progress. And the economic security is closely tied to the defense and national security. You know, I don't have any evidence, but who knows? North Korea might be, trying to hack into the Canadian businesses. North Korea has been making a lot of money in funding their, nuclear missile system through all these kind of cybersecurity hacking. So it's important that we engage more in these kind of topics. I think I think the Canada is too insulated from some of the global crises that are happening outside. You know, I think that's another reason probably why we've fallen behind Australia economically. So we can't just rely on natural resources that are in the ground, and it's going forward will be very different and very competitive global world and very unstable global world, and we need to broaden our vision and beyond North America and really start you know, having deep discussions about what we should do going forward.
Thanks, Sonny. Roberto.
It's a great question, Dr. Quinn, and I think a great transition on the panel. If we look at economic security and or security and prosperity, I think one of the pieces naively to look at is that if we want to close that trade gap, we need to look at one company at a time, especially in this SME space. But in the reality of it, if one company goes to the region on their own, trying to knock on doors, navigate the intricacies of the ecosystem of the Indo-Pacific region and finding contracts and partners, we're never going to get there. And so from our standpoint, partnership, and we talked about 3 Ps before, perseverance, presence, and price. Partnership is actually one that we reiterate to Canadian business as well. The provincial partners, the federal partners, the private partners, they're all helping to support Canadian companies in terms of trade and getting into the region as well. There's a Canadian company, Clarius Mobile Health, that's a client of Export Development Canada out of Vancouver, BC. And we recently promoted a piece on them too, but they were influenced in the last 3 years by 7 different Team Canada partners to get into the region. And so this is a Canadian company now. They specialize in mobile ultrasound care. They're in the majority of markets in the Indo-Pacific region, including China, Korea, Japan, Indonesia, the Philippines. And they've done so with the support of partnership around the table. And is it realistic for Team Canada to come around every small, medium enterprise or large enterprise as well and look at growth into the region, that approach? No, but I think we need to do a better job from a partnerships perspective and a Crown Corporation perspective, working together and being more proactive with Canadian companies. The other piece I wanted to touch on before we go is I think we're naive to also look at the region and say there's all these opportunities, but there's no challenges. Because there's certainly a lot of challenges in trading in the Indo-Pacific region, along with challenges in other markets as well. But oftentimes, trading from a Canadian company into a country in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, China, etc., is a leap of faith from them as well. And oftentimes, as we talked about, they've built their foundation on North American sales. Now they're looking to grow and capture a portion of that market share. And when things go south, that could be detrimental for their optimism and their willingness to expand in the region. And so if you look at an example for us, like Coulson Aviation, Canadian company out of Port Alberni, they shifted about 20 years ago their business from a traditional logging company here in Western Canada to actually fighting fires in North America. And now one of their largest markets is in the Indo-Pacific region. It was because they took a leap of faith into the Australian market. They grew into the Indonesian market a number of years ago and had a transaction fall south, and it was the Team Canada partners that were there along with EDC to help support them in that growth. But if the partnership of Team Canada wasn't there, that could be detrimental as well. And so I think we need to look at there's challenges in the region. We need to be there to support through rough waters as well, because ultimately it's immense opportunity as well.
All right. Well, thanks, Roberto. That brought us perfectly up to 10:50, so I'm sorry for Graham and Carlo. You're not going to get to weigh in, but the front half of the Q&A was balanced in your favor, so I think there's no lost opportunity. Thanks, everybody, for the great questions, and to our panelists for walking us through such a wonderful conversation.